Hi there, folks. Today we're talking about the urban economy. And just for numeric purposes, to separate our chapters, this is going to be chapter 12 for us. Again, the urban economy is what we're talking about. And so we know ultimately that an economy is a system of producing and distributing goods and services. And so it's really the overarching system of how we get the stuff that we need to live our lives and to survive within the culture. And so as we think about getting those basic goods and getting those basic services, and again, we in looking at this more concretely, we have to break it down and look at the evolution of economics, particularly urban economics, over the last several decades. So we begin with looking at and focusing on and talking about some trends. One of the main trends that definitely rather economically has impacted cities and metro areas pretty quickly and pretty immediately has been the national shift from manufacturing to services. So we often call that deindustrialization. So it's a way of describing what wasn't, or I should say, what isn't and wasn't a formal sort of scheduled shift. This was ultimately the uh, ushering in of service-based economies came for a few different cross-cutting kinds of reasons. And one of the things that we saw, of course, with manufacturing, particularly if we look at the history of manufacturing here in the Midwest and the Northeast, so manufacturing powerhouses like Michigan, if we look at places like Pittsburgh, if we look at places for instance, like Chicago, a lot of these northeastern, midwestern powerhouse manufacturing hubs and cities, things shifted, if you will, for a few key reasons away from their core manufacturing hub roots. And one of the bigger reasons for that shift or that decline in manufacturing is simply that technology changed in such a way that shifted the gross need for manufacturing, if you will, in as much as we had been doing up to that point, especially going into the 1970s. However, also manufacturing shifts away, particularly from the Northeast and Midwest, geographically, due to its presence, its outcroppings elsewhere. And so we see manufacturing start to crop up in parts of the South, but also abroad. And so you get, again, you have other, uh, if you will, sectors geographically and increasingly globally that could take on those functions, that could provide steel, that could provide parts, if you will, in supplier based manufacturing for, if you will, the auto industry. So we have an array now of nations, territories, countries, if you will, that are a part of, if you will, the global assembly process with respect to the auto industry and auto manufacturing and durable goods, of course, which is a big part of Michigan's economy still, again, durable goods manufacturing. And so, again, the presence, if you will, of, in a sense, competitors, people who could provide the manufacturing services elsewhere, in addition to the technology being able to eliminate many steps of the manufacturing process altogether with respect to traditional sort of human based, if you will, manufacturing. So with the advent of those things, this is where we start to see significant changes, particularly in cities of the Northeast and Midwest, the stronger, if you will, historic manufacturing hubs of the country. So and again, this generally starts to unfold and get its legs after World War II, and then it rapidly picks up, particularly after 1970. And again, uh, often having a lot to do with, if you will, large scale changes in technology and technological output and sophistication. Again, now we have entire factories and plants and warehouses that are run physically, ultimately, by machine technologies that are ultimately electronically driven, that don't require the work and the scale of work of human beings in manufacturing capacities. And so that again, we start to see seeds of that form after the Second World War, and again, picking up in earnest, particularly more technologically based forms of manufacturing that are advanced, that sort of supplant or replace the need for, if you will, a sort of in vivo live kind of human experience with respect to how a lot of that manufacturing gets done. So, all that is also happening along with another trend, suburbanization. Of course, we've talked about that, the shift, if you will, from populations to core central cities into the suburban areas and the suburban ring. And so, again, we're looking at the availability of transportation, but we're also looking at the facilitation of this, if you will, uh, by the federal government, particularly as it undergirded the highway system, as well as low interest loans for developers to develop houses in the burbs, as well as for low interest loans after World War II, so that returning war vets, those who were white, working class, and middle class and beyond, in particular, they were the beneficiaries of these directed, targeted loan programs that were really there to prop up and create a norm of home ownership with low money down kinds of loans backed by the federal government. And so, again, the fears were, especially after the Second World War, were that the nation would go into a deep depression, much like we saw happening throughout Europe in its post war time. So, the idea was in stimulating the economy with the highway system, with loans directed towards war veterans coming back from the war effort, towards home ownership and home construction, also helping out and incentivizing development of such. That is what really pulls us out of urban core areas. We'll also talk about the role that urban unrest and the difficulties, if you will, policing within cities, but also maintaining social control within cities as it has been traditionally defined. A lot of this also emerges during this post war period as well, especially in terms of the equality movements and civil rights also happening, particularly in large part and concentration during the 1960s and 1970s. And so once we get to the urban unrest chapter, we'll look more closely at that and how that calculus also plays a role with respect to uh, the move away from core central cities and core urban areas all across the country. Again, not just in areas that we think of often when we think of cities that have declined somewhat, especially if we're thinking about the Northeast and the Midwest. Now, globalization, of course, we've been more or less sort of hinting at that, if you will, intimating that. So, again, we're looking at with globalization, the lessening of importance, if you will, of uh, national and international sorts of borders with respect to the manufacturing process. And so, not that borders don't matter at all, not that borders don't have any significance, but when it comes down to it, when we look at our cell phones, when we look at our computers, when we look at our laptops, our PCs, when we look at our vehicles for those who drive, when we look at the tangible goods that we have, those material culture items that we talk about within sociology, much of our material culture, although it's certainly made and intended for this economy and intended for US consumers, often we're looking at uh, devices and we're looking at products that are made in a smattering of different far flung kinds of economic endeavors and circumstances that really involve a lot of different workers in different countries, sort of having this kind of global supply chain approach. So our phone or our phones come to us having uh, microchips, having, if you will, other kinds of processing equipment and technology embedded in them that are often produced in other parts of the world. Let's say, for instance, in Germany, or let's say, for instance, in China. Those are two big places where we often see a lot of the cell phone oriented technologies sort of uh, coalescing and coming from. And so those countries and those economies are critical to, again, what happens when we get the end product, the end cell phone, for instance, that is meant for us to use. And so, again, we need these global networks. We need those, and those, again, are sustained uh, to a fair extent, going back to what we had said about the global city concept offered by Saskia Sassen. So these cities like New York, London, Tokyo, they have those coordinating kinds of functions for the cell phone that you eventually buy. that you use on a regular basis, for the vehicle that you drive or that you rent, for instance, or use for ride sharing. And so, again, these global cities are emergent and have been emergent because of much of what we see with respect to globalization of economics. All right. And another trend that we can't leave out also is what we call conglomeration. So that's just a fancy way of talking about larger companies that control or buy out many smaller companies, or that they have within them a lot of nested smaller operations that at one point may have actually been another entity altogether. And so we often, what we see in our current economic endeavors, excuse me, is that we'll have large corporations. Let's say it's an automobile manufacturer, let's say, for instance, in the case of Michigan. And so it's very common over, and we've seen this, for instance, with more recently Fiat Chrysler, now Stellantis. We're looking at the mashing and merging and the mashing up of a lot of what were formerly private businesses or entities that were separate. They come together. And so in that process, they get more economies of scale. They can do more things in bulk at a cheaper price, and it allows them to dominate the market in a variety of different ways and fashions. And so with that comes pros and with that comes cons. The pros, of course, are often good for the companies, but they can present challenges for the workers when you've got, or you're talking about, a new merged entity, for instance. And so we've seen that in addition to Stellantis, we've seen that with Dow DuPont, two companies that were based in two different states. Dow, of course, based here in Midland, Michigan, but also DuPont based in Wilmington, Delaware, two big chemical giants. Again, those cultures came together about a year or so ago. And so now you're looking at ultimately a sort of two-in-one conglomerate kind of company that has, if you will, dual headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware, as well as Midland, Michigan. So those are great examples of, on the local front, how we can see conglomeration playing out, if you will, with respect to economics. And so now we have to look at what happens within cities and what sort of become the urban trends that are economic effects as a result of the trends that we just laid out: manufacturing, suburbanization, globalization, and conglomeration. So one of the main things is that, again, we're looking at manufacturing continuing rather to decline. We certainly still have significant manufacturing output and outlay in these urban areas throughout the Northeast and the Midwest in particular, and also other parts of the country as well. But again, based upon historic shipping patterns and shipping routes, based upon the raw material necessary for the production and distribution of these goods. Often the Northeast and Midwest are where you see these kinds of operations more concentrated the most. So manufacturing is still here, it's still present, but it's a more advanced kind of manufacturing. It's the kind of manufacturing that, again, we tend to see workers go on for advanced training beyond high school in order to attain, particularly going to a college or a university to get skilled and trained within that, in addition to getting on the job kinds of training. And so what happens, of course, is traditional manufacturing that's not advanced. If we're looking at unskilled labor, if we're looking at semi-skilled labor, those are the manufacturing positions that we see leave. So the unskilled labor, the semi-skilled labor, those positions declined dramatically, especially during the 1970s into the present. And so we saw a strong, high retrenchment of these kinds of jobs. And again, these jobs often were taken away in a sort of 1-2 punch. They were taken away, uh, if you will, by workers ultimately in other far-flung economies, maybe in other parts of the country, like in the South, or certainly in other parts of the globe, other parts of the world, but also, of course, increasingly, what was formerly unskilled labor and what was formerly semi-skilled labor has now often been taken over by machines and machine technologies that are advanced, that are sophisticated electronically and otherwise, if you will, for these machines to work in a sort of automated or a semi-automated fashion to create and assemble the product without much human intervention. And so some of this goes back to what we also talk about in the intro to sociology course. Some of this stuff is related to the concept of McDonaldization. And so we're looking at again, mass production that, in a sense, can be sort of McDonaldized by machine technologies and advanced computing rather technologies also uh, put together for that purpose. So that's really the true decline that we've seen most in manufacturing, especially if we're looking at the core urban Midwest and Northeast. We're looking at the sort of severe decline of those um, lower skill, low skill, high wage. Think about that. So we saw and have seen a significant decline of high wage, low skill kinds of jobs that were ultimately based in unskilled labor and semi-skilled labor. I remember when I first moved to Michigan and first moved to the Flint area about 17 years ago. I remember hearing the stories of what it was like up into the 1980s, into the early 80s. Folks would talk about at the college, they would talk about how much some of the GM workers would get, or workers in other manufacturing kinds of endeavors, that they, in a sense, got paid, and often did, not just in a sense, they were paid more than people who worked in college and university settings. And so, with that in mind, that gives you a glimpse of just the ability at that time for those workers to generate significant amounts of income. And so, that time of prosperity, again, think about that, the sort of semi skilled, unskilled labor, low wage, or rather, I should say high wage, but low skilled kinds of positions. So that exchange, again, we just don't really see that. We don't see those high wage, low skilled jobs in mass concentrations here like we used to. And so what that does, of course, is that immediately hits the pockets of workers. It immediately hits the communities, if you will, that the workers are ensconced in. And so if we think of the I-75 corridor here in the state of Michigan, we're looking at Saginaw, Flint, and Detroit, and some of their constituent suburbs. Some of them were heavily impacted, certainly, by the tremendous loss of manufacturing output and manufacturing job loss over the past 4 to 5 decades. And so this is what we have seen, especially in terms of long-term unemployment, multi-generational joblessness and poverty. Those become easier to understand when you think about the juxtaposition again of those high wage, low skill jobs and what happens when they go away. And so eventually, even though that really looks at and involves certainly workers who are manufacturing employees, at the same time, they support retail establishments. They go to bars, they go to restaurants, they go on vacation. And so you start to see the significant impact of their loss of employment over time and what that does. And so um, the film Roger and Me is a good way of looking at what that ultimately that process did to the city of Flint, especially if we look at a lot of Flint's neighborhoods as well as downtown Flint, and what happened during the time that Michael Moore chronicled the changes in Flint. And the film, of course, came out in 1989. And so it's a good way of looking at things sort of uh, within this process that weren't just routine ways of businesses functioning. And so that's one thing that documentary reminds us of, that this is not just simply the cost of doing business. We have to look at what this has done systemically to urban areas all across the country. Now, this loss of manufacturing, again, it is again concentrated in the, uh, if you will, semi-skilled and unskilled labor in those pools, in those parts of the labor market. And so this disproportionately hurts people who are poor and hurts people who are working class, because they no longer have a route, an opportunity to get to the middle class readily. So you don't have that reliable, in a sense, what was formerly sustainable, semi-skilled labor, unskilled labor kind of position that was supported by a often high wage, a high union wage in particular. So we also see entry level work begin to shift to the suburbs. So some of the first jobs that people have, the second jobs that people may have in their careers, especially by the 1980s, we start to see those entry level positions change in a couple of ways. They change in that they move toward the suburban ring. They also change in terms of how much they provide. They don't provide nearly the kind of living wage that they used to. Um, and again, uh, we see that these tend to be service based kinds of positions because, again, that's largely what we're seeing grow in the edge city kind of phenomenon that begins to happen during the 80s, especially with now, by that time, I should say, a couple of decades having gone by of suburbanization. And so, again, that's what really happens there. And so the poor are also hurt by the jobs housing mismatch, wherein you may live in one place because it's more affordable, but the jobs are located somewhere else. And so we still see that in and around mid and southeast Michigan, for instance. And so if you think of the Flint based MTA, Mass Transit Association, administration, I should say, the MTA goes to at least 5 different counties, from what I understand. And that is simply because many of the job rich areas, are well outside of not only the city of Flint, but they are well outside of Genesee County. So we tend to find the job rich areas in counties like Macomb County, Oakland County, and Livingston County. And again, we tend to see ways within which the MTA can get and convey workers as close to those destinations as possible. So the MTA goes up and down I-75 to places like Auburn Hills and Troy to get workers back and forth from Flint to those destinations. All right. So again, with conglomeration, we have to talk about that in terms of the local impact of those mergers and acquisitions. And so skilled services begin to concentrate in key areas, key sites. And so again, think about what we said of those global cities, for instance. Um, so when I was in high school and in college, Charlotte, North Carolina was an area that benefited from a great amount of this. And so there was a savings and loan uh, sort of bailout that happened where a number of savings and loans organizations, so these were sort of like banks, sort of like credit unions, but a number of them failed. And so Charlotte, North Carolina area banks like First Union and at the time NCNB, North Carolina National Bank, which is now Bank of America, but those two, First Union and NCNB, they were able to just buy up a lot of the banks that were savings and loans that didn't do so well, that were failing. And in the process, they became, Charlotte and these constituent banks became among the biggest banking centers, not only in the country, but in the world. And so that's one of the ways within which Charlotte uh, came to power in terms of banking and finance. All right. So another thing that begins to happen, especially in terms of what goes on for the working class and for the poor, often involves the growth of the informal economy, if rather informal economy, what we sometimes call the underground economy. And so this involves a number of different things. People who may sell loose cigarettes, they may sell mixtapes or CDs, they may sell scented oils, incense. It runs the gamut from things like that to garage sales to people who do your taxes. A lot of you know somebody in your neighborhood or know someone wherever you grew up, for instance, who may watch kids for a fee. Sometimes there's someone who sells drugs. So these kinds of informal economic opportunities, they start to sprout up and become much, much more critical. They become a lifeline, particularly by the 1980s for a number of uh, former workers, if you will, that may have had in the past a semi skilled or unskilled labor job that would have paid more. Or again, it perhaps is the son or the daughter, the children, if you will, of someone who had worked a position like that. And so this becomes much, much more critical to how a lot of functions are ultimately meted out and how people get funds to transact essential business that they need for their daily and their everyday living. And so when you see or think about the drawing away of jobs from urban areas and urban core areas, particularly that are disproportionately poor and that are more likely concentrated of folks of color. So when jobs and opportunity go away from those areas, again, we're looking at what people are doing to find a way to survive and often to thrive. And so the informal economic activity does indeed form a core of how they need to ultimately survive within urban areas. Because again, the loss of significant, we're looking at the loss of significant formal or mainstream economic activity from certain neighborhoods. And so that becomes a key challenge, particularly for cities, for their residents to find viable employment opportunities or to do something instead. And also, what happens, granted, the informal underground economy works for those who can work it, but at the same time, you're looking at a net loss of tax revenue because, again, these are overwhelmingly untaxed kinds of services. And if you will, they're really largely peer to peer kinds of transactions. So they're not really mediated by a formal mainstream economy. All right. Now, economic policy is really critically important during this discussion and during this time in particular. And so a lot of what we've seen, especially in the last 40 years, since the 80s, we've generally seen business-oriented economic development policies that are efforts by typically the federal government and to some extent state and local governments to spur on and grow business, to have business be comfortable transacting itself in urban areas and in urban locations. And so often what is done is legislation and policy is passed in such a way to make these efforts much more uh, routine, much more manageable in ways that promote good business, in a way that will promote good business that, if you will, business owners can count on being able to make and secure some kind of profit. So attract new business, enable business to thrive. You're looking typically at public-private partnerships. For instance, if you're looking at stadiums, stadiums are often the, if you will, biggest, literally, example of public-private partnerships. And so often taxes that are levied, for instance, on hotels, casinos, a lot of those monies are collected in a sense in a big pot, and they can be used to defray the cost of a team owner building a new stadium. And so it looks like, hey, we're in this together. This is a way that we get this new arena. This is the way that we go about making sure that the team stays. And so a lot of what business oriented economic development is all about is how do we keep these big businesses comfortable, happy, satisfied? How do we keep them in and around this community and keep them from leaving the community? And so these can take many forms. They can be tax abatements. They can be ways to get land for a very reduced nominal cost to be redeveloped. And so one of the ways that happened classically during the Clinton years were what we called enterprise zones, where there's a specific geography that businesses are incentivized to locate within. And so if they locate there, they get certain tax abatements. If they hire workers from within the zone, they can also get certain tax abatements as well. So the great thing about the business-oriented economic development is that it's great for business. It's a great way to prop up business and to promote business. And the thought was, especially during the 1990s, during the Clinton administration especially, the thought was, well, if this is done in enough abundance or in abundance, that what we'll have is we'll have situations that will ultimately trickle down to workers. That if we incentivize businesses to work here, or to rather open up shop here, workers will also naturally be a part of that process because those same businesses are going to want to, uh, if you will, maximize the incentives that they get by hiring the local workers. Challenge with that, though, is think about what we said about globalization, about technology. We've seen that, especially over the last 40 years, what businesses often trying to do or have been able to do is invest in labor-saving technologies that actually allow them to profit even more by not having to hire or hold on to workers as much. And so that becomes an issue when you can invest in more technologies that don't really require you to hire more labor, that require over time that you hire less labor. And so that becomes an issue. Not to mention the kinds of jobs that we tend to see created from these sorts of approaches tend to be more entry level kinds of jobs. They're not jobs that are going to be paying a living wage as much. They are jobs that don't necessarily pay a prevailing union wage. And so that becomes an issue. And so what we've typically seen is that there's more of a bias that's inherent in these economic development processes. And so the idea here in the research has shown is that often the public good is put to the side and that business is paramount, and propping up and supporting business is what often we see. And so in many cases, the propping up of business comes at the expense of the community. That's what we see typically with the business-oriented economic development policies. Also, cities have little power to exert over the failed promises of increased jobs and revenue. And so there's not much that the city can do once this has actually occurred. And so HBO, for instance, did a really good expose about this with respect to the Little Caesars Arena construction and the aftermath of such. And so much of the District Detroit project and process, much of that, um, some have argued, particularly within that HBO documentary, much of that came at the expense of the community in and around the Cass Corridor, in and around, for instance, the Little Caesars Arena. So again, it's definitely a debate to consider, and it's something to ponder in terms of, okay, who benefits? We have a number of ways that we collect money and revenue from how we conduct and transact business. Aren't there ways that we can really ensure that this truly goes to the people who need it the most and to the public coffers? Now, overwhelmingly sociologists, overwhelmingly those within the social sciences, generally support people-oriented economic development policies and projects. And so one of the more recent examples we can think of this is the $1.9 trillion stimulus package that we saw pass recently in Congress just a couple of weeks ago. So what happens with people-oriented approaches, the idea is to get resources, be it training for jobs, be it training for starting a business that is truly a lower, smaller scale, local business, supporting local entrepreneurs. So that's sort of what the goal here tends to be. Job training, job retraining, uh, investing in workers, investing in worker education, investing in local communities. And so in so doing, you have what we call, again, people-oriented economic development. And so the idea here is that funds can be used to establish uh, job training and economic development initiatives for established businesses, not large-scale ones, but particularly more mom and pop kinds of businesses. And so the idea here is to, hey, get people who are local to be employed in these businesses, help them see that work is viable, and have a plan for them to ultimately have a base level of self-sufficiency within the community. And so often the goals are a bit different. And so you can draw on a number of sources to get this people-oriented development going. There can be economic capital drawn upon, so money, property, stocks, cultural capital, so the knowledge and skills that are acquired from education and experience, social capital. So these kinds of things tend to be leveraged in the more people-oriented economic development approach. And so think about it. With the stimulus package, there's obviously direct stimulus to individuals, direct payments to households and families. There's also, and that covers 85% of American households, there's also direct stimulus and payment to institutions. And so state and local governments are getting hundreds of billions of dollars to help cope with the pandemic related loss of coffers. If you will, we've lost significant revenue in state and local governments all across the country. And so these people oriented economic development approaches, much like we saw with the stimulus, are an effort to, again, get money and resources directly into the hands of the people, because again, the average person doesn't invest in the stock market. The average person does not own a multinational corporation or control such. So how they spend their money is actually really in the long run going to help that multinational corporation as well as the mom and pop business on Main Street as well.